Hello and welcome to the TF1 show. I'm your host, Tinus and today I have some very serious matters to address before I continue with the episode. Some eagle-eared I don't know if eagles have good ears, so let's rather say some bat-eared listeners picked up that I might have gotten some of the launch dates wrong on last week's episode, and very kindly they then pointed out my mistakes. So I've therefore decided to put out a public statement which will clarify my position. To whom it may concern, I, Tinus Ferreira, host of the much vaunted and respected podcast, The TF1 Show, would like to apologize to any member of the public who I offended, upset, confused or befuddled with my lack of mastery over the basic Gregorian calendar. I was and am humbled by this mistake and will set out to not only prevent this from ever happening again, but to strive to be a better, well-rounded communicator and ensure that no incorrect date will ever be uttered from these lips again. I would like to ask for privacy in this difficult time, and I do hope that you, member of the public, will eventually find it in your heart to forgive me. End statement. So now that we've got the PR out of the way, let's dive into what today's episode is really about. The car reveals of the top 3 teams we looked at over the past week, and I guess we can start chronologically, and therefore let's kick off with Ferrari, who launched their car on last week Tuesday. Now, for whoever watched the live stream, yes, there was a massive live streamed event in a very, very fancy and Italian opera theater, it seemed like. There were music, there was a DJ set, there were brass bands, some choir people in t-shirts that seemed to take it very seriously. They even marched down the aisle up to the stage before the true star of the show was revealed. There were acrobats, some people lifting each other up and putting them down again. It was, Ferrari threw the entire kitchen sink at this show. And that's even before we got to some of the very interesting speeches in Italian that obviously I couldn't follow. But nevertheless, after all of this build-up and hype and drama and extravagance, the curtain was finally metaphorically lifted over the SF1000, which got its name from the fact that Ferrari is due to contest its 1000th Grand Prix over the 2020 season. I'm going to be honest and say that I don't actually know when the 1000th Grand Prix for Ferrari is going to be, since I don't think, it's very much dependent on when you start counting, because there's all sort of different ways of counting what was the true first Grand Prix, or whether it was the first World Championship Grand Prix. And I don't want to get into that debate with anybody. So let's just decide that at some point in this 2020 season, Ferrari will have its 1000th Grand Prix and leave that rest. Cool. So the first impression I got from looking at the Ferrari was that it is red, which I guess isn't really a surprise to anybody. And the second thing that I saw was that they decided to stick to the inboard loaded front wing design that they had last year, which was obviously very publicized, that it was in contrast to the approach that both Mercedes and Red Bull took with their front wing designs. Now Ferrari decided that they will stick to their guns and they will continue forging ahead on this aerodynamic path that they've set for themselves, and that they do think that they will be able to recapture some of the downforce deficits that they had further along in the car's aerodynamic design, given that I guess that was sort of the main Achilles heel for them to fix over the winter, and that's where they ended up losing out to the other 2 teams. So obviously they decided to stick to this front wing design from what I can see. And maybe I should add a disclaimer at this point and say that I am not a Formula One mechanical engineer or an aerodynamicist, so I will not be giving you the deep details to the exact millimeter of what the potential airflow effects of changes like this will be. I will only give high-level overviews of what I've been seeing and obviously what the people have been saying over the past week in terms of analyzing each of these cars. So just, before I might have to issue another public statement during next week's episode. But anyways, I digress. So it seems like Ferrari has adapted some of the front suspension tricks that Mercedes brought to the party during last year's season, with the sort of a pivot point attaching to the front wheels that when on full lock, the front wing actually dips down due to the suspension, which obviously helps all sorts of airflow movements and also, I guess, some of the front downforce. Ferrari seems to have worked a lot on their side bargeboard area with more intricate boomerang structures and lots of little turning vanes and all sorts of carbon fiber pieces jutting out at interesting angles, all in the mission, I guess, to try and control the airflow and to really maximize the downforce capabilities of the car concept that they've pursued. They seem to have with their side pods, and this is something that I'm probably going to talk about a lot over the next 15 minutes, because a lot of teams have seemed to have focused their efforts around slimming down the side pods and also packaging the rear of the car very tightly. And Ferrari is no different in this specific area. They have seemed to have taken a bit of a Red Bull approach, Red Bull 2019 approach with their side pods, and have completely changed, I guess, sort of the way that the side pods move and where they are in relation to the other bits of the car. Now, Ferrari seem to be very proud about the fact that they were able to very, very tightly package the rear of the car. And I don't know, when looking at the other two teams, which seem to have achieved exactly the same thing, I guess doesn't seem that spectacular that they did. Seems very similar to what Red Bull and Mercedes were able to do. But in any case, they were very proud of the fact that they were able to repackage the rear so tightly. And obviously there's lots of aerodynamic benefit there at the rear, because effectively you are providing more space for the air to move back to the sort of low pressure area of the car at the back, where the diffuser and the rear wing can perform its magic and provide that rear downforce. Now, the last thing I guess I can mention about the Ferrari car was an interesting sort of like a devil's horn that they put on the side pod. Don't really know whether there's going to be a massive aerodynamic benefit to that, but obviously they felt that some sort of airflow guidance and airflow control that they can gain from putting those little two horns on the side pod is worth adding. So they've done that, which I think is interesting. But all in all, not too dramatic a change for Ferrari, which I guess was expected by all of us, since the regulations are pretty stable, and that I don't think any team wants to take a massive risk and sort of redo their entire aerodynamic basis and potentially take the risk of completely missing the mark. Where I think both the top three teams, as we'll see with Red Bull and Mercedes just a bit later, have decided to very much stick to their core philosophy and to basically just refine and find little marginal gains everywhere around the car. Cool. And then the next big car that was launched was the Red Bull. Now, this was much less of an extravaganza than the Ferrari launch, where Red Bull basically posted a picture on social media. Didn't really give us a lot of pictures or a lot of information to work from. And then later on in the day, they did a bit of a shakedown where Max Verstappen took the car around Silverstone for the first time. So there, I guess, from those pictures, we got the opportunity to see the car in a bit more detail. And the most apparent change from the Red Bull, from my perspective, was the fact that they slimmed down their front, the nose of the car quite a bit to look more in line with what we saw from Mercedes over the last couple of years. So they have a much slimmer nose and a much more pronounced cape sort of underneath the front wing due to that. And then also they were one of the few teams that ran this little nostril at the opening of the front wing, which have now refined into multiple nostrils that obviously channel through the front wing, and then the air sent in all sorts of different directions, just as Adrian Newey would have wanted. But so you can see Red Bull have done some refinements and have done some significant work around the front wing, have moved a bit away from their fully outboard loaded front wing that they had last year, and slightly moving towards a more Ferrari type solution. But I think all teams are sort of trying to find that sweet spot between the two, in terms of the Ferrari approach that provides the additional outwash and the bit more stability in terms of the airflow, and then obviously the Mercedes Red Bull approach with the outboard loaded front wing that I think provides a bit more provides higher peak downforce essentially. So Red Bull has done some tinkering there. Another interesting thing that we saw on the Red Bull was also the fact that they've really trimmed down those side pods, much slimmer than last year. And I think the slimmest out of the three. So all in sort of the mission of packaging these cars as tightly as possible and providing us as little air resistance as possible when moving through the air. Similar to Ferrari, they've worked on tightening up and packaging the rear a lot more tightly than last year, which I guess is an effect or a consequence of just understanding these cars a lot better now at the beginning of this season compared to last season. Now, the last interesting thing about Red Bull that I saw was some very fascinating rear suspension setups. Now, I am very much not an expert in terms of suspension kinematics or suspension geometry, so the possible implications of this I can't necessarily tell you. I guess we'll have to see how it all unfolds on the track, but just something to look out for, I guess, in terms of looking at the Red Bull car and seeing what they've been able to do with their suspension. Right, now the last out of the top three teams that revealed their car on Valentine's Day was Mercedes. Now, people were initially very upset with them at the beginning of last week because they launched their new livery, which was essentially the same livery as last year with a little bit of red lipstick put on the top airbox. Now, I personally am not too offended by liveries remaining the same. I mean, Ferraris and Red Bulls also remain the same. Some people on social media were furious with the lack of creativity from the top three teams. But anyways, don't really mind that much. So let's maybe talk about the Mercedes launch. So again, they posted a picture on social media similar to Red Bull. And then again, similar to Red Bull, had a shakedown at Silverstone where Hamilton and Bottas took the car around for a couple of laps. Now, I think at least from my perspective, the Mercedes, when you look at it initially, looks to have been the least affected by the additional years worth of stable regulations. The car looked pretty similar to the way it looked at the end of last year. The front wing doesn't seem to have changed by much. There's some small changes on the suspension from what I could see, especially the rear suspension. And then similar to the other three cars, they very much tightened the side pod, so a lot smaller the air inlets in the side pod area. And again, massively tighten up the rear in terms of, maximizing the available space that they have at the back of the car, which obviously optimizes the airflow there. So, I think Mercedes are really at a point where they're finding marginal gains. And, if you look back over the last couple of years, Mercedes has never been the ones with the very, very sort of noticeable big dramatic changes to the exterior of the car or any interesting, aerodynamic pieces, but have more been the team that can really shave off these half a tenth of seconds across each and every area of the car by making small refinements and making sure each and every single component works well in tandem with the others. So I guess we can't be too surprised to see a Mercedes that at least, on the outside looks pretty similar to last year, but I promise you there's going to be all sorts of interesting tricks hidden in that car, similar to, the front suspension tricks that we saw and all sorts of other, little tidbits that Mercedes implement before the other teams actually figure out what they're doing. So in terms of the top three, I think Red Bull was probably the one that made the most interesting changes. The new front wing of theirs is going to be fascinating to see whether that actually provides them with any form of gain, whether that solves some of the problems that they had with the front wing last year. I think it's going to be very close between the top three teams. I think given the differences between the Ferrari and the Mercedes and Red Bull design philosophies, it's probably going to be a case of at different tracks, different teams are going to be strong. Whichever team is the strongest in aggregate across, I guess this is sort of obvious, across the season, will come out to be the champion, similar to the approach that Mercedes took last year, where they sort of conceded the fact that on low downforce tracks they're probably going to lose out to Ferrari, but then made sure that in aggregate over the year their car was going to be the strongest. So I think taking that into account, I would still say Mercedes is the favorite going into the season. And I think Red Bull might hit the ground running for the first time in the last couple of years. So expect Red Bull to challenge Mercedes quite closely. And I think Ferrari is still going to try and find some remaining pieces of downforce on some specific tracks. But then let's see, on some of the lower downforce tracks, they might actually be further ahead than what they were last year. Now, we also saw some other car launches. We saw McLaren launch their car. It's orange and blue like last year. They also seem to have done some work on the front wing. I think a lot of sort of new 2020 bits were still left off the launch spec car that we saw. So I think more a case of us waiting and seeing what McLaren do come up with this week in testing. We saw some photographs of the new Haas car. I think for Haas, their main objective will just be to just make their car be more predictable and to ensure that they actually understand, in which direction to go in terms of car setup and which weaknesses of the car they still need to address. Because last year was just such a disaster because nobody knew what was going on with the car. Sometimes it was fast, sometimes it was slow. It couldn't work the tires. Just basically they want to correct those wrongs and make sure that they actually have a solid foundation to work from and then develop from there. We saw the new AlphaTauri, not quite sure yet how you should pronounce it. But we saw the old Toro Rosso, now the new AlphaTauri car. Very, very nice livery, black and white or navy and white. Looks very nice, obviously, the car. In terms of the, the design or the aerodynamic pieces, nothing very interesting popped out from what I could see. Looks similar to last year and still obviously uses some Red Bull hand-me-downs as they always have done. Now, lastly, and this was a team's launch that I was sort of looking forward to. Now, Renault decided to spare no expense and have, some elaborate launch event in Paris. And, the world's journalists descended upon Paris to see this unveiling of the new Renault for the 2020 season. And what they got for their efforts was 4 photographs of a Formula One car in black with absolutely no form of sensible information at all on these pictures. So Renault obviously have decided to keep us waiting for a bit longer, with their logic or argument for this being that they don't condone the launching of fake cars during launch week. Now, don't know how fake the Mercedes and the Red Bull was on the track, but evidently Renault have decided that actually all of these car launches are fictional and that the true car launches will only happen next week in Barcelona. So I really hope for their part that they that this is their true reason and that they weren't late with the actual car, and that's why they ended up not actually revealing anything. So I guess we'll have to wait and see what they come up with this week in Barcelona. But fingers crossed that they can sort out some of the issues, because I think they have a wonderful driver pairing in Ricciardo and Ocon. And I do want to see these midfield teams, especially McLaren and Renault, at the front of the pack, fighting for a podium here and there. Now, speaking of testing, I guess at this point it might be wise to talk about what we can expect. I think first and foremost we'll see the true colors in, let's just say, let's be quite pragmatic here and say the true colors, but not really the true colors of the cars. Obviously, teams are going to try and trick each other and withhold as much information as possible during the testing. But we'll finally see the sort of different design packages that the teams have come up with. I think we'll see the top teams especially trial different sort of pieces, different front wings, different barge board setups. You never know what they're going to kind of come up with. But basically all going to be part of them trying to figure out which approach is going to be the best for them to take into the beginning of the season. Now, another thing that we'll probably be seeing is this thing called a glory run. Now, glory run, for those who don't know, is where a team basically just puts in as little as fuel as possible, sends the car out and does an incredibly fast lap time, only for it to turn out that all of the other teams are just going about their business, not really pushing, that much. And then this team effectively looks a lot better relative to the others. Now, I don't really know why teams would want to do this. Some people say that they do this to attract sponsors, so that sponsors can see how high up they are on the timing screen, and that would therefore lead to checks and money and wealth. But I don't really know in the real world how often that happens. Now, the second thing that you'll see is sandbagging, and this is something that we've seen used a lot, especially in Mercedes have been mocked for this. You fuel up the car quite a bit, and then you basically just pound around the track lap after lap after lap, and not really showing your true pace relative to the others. Now, Ferrari fell victim to this last year in testing, where I think they all came away from the test thinking that they're going to probably be the fastest, especially at the opening few races, just to come to Australia, and for Mercedes actually saying, lol, joke, kidding, we weren't really showing our true pace up at, during the last day of testing. So we're definitely going to be seeing some of that. I know Red Bull always is keen for a bit of a cat and mouse, a bit of a Cluedo type game where we don't really know how fast they truly are. So it's going to be interesting to see what the teams come up with and how they are able to thwart each other over the days of testing. Now, the last thing to look out for is probably the team that's in the best shape is going to be the team that can put together as many laps as possible. Now, this has been the age-old strategy of Mercedes, where they just put the drivers in the car and they just pound around lap after lap after lap, gathering as much data as possible in order to optimize their package for the first race. So I think look out for teams that are doing a lot of consistent running, because those teams are the ones that are getting through their checklist and getting through all of their different testing programs and are probably going to come out of testing the most optimistic and with the most promise. So there you go, good listeners. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and that you are willing to formalize this enjoyment by leaving a comment, a rating, or by hitting the subscribe button. I look forward to sitting through testing with you all over the coming weeks and to provide you with all of the juiciest information bits over the coming few days. Now, you can follow me on Twitter, where my handle is @TheTF1Show, or on Instagram, where my handle is @TheTF1Show, where I will be sharing my thoughts intermittently. We'll chat again soon. Bye.